Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, August 3rd. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the Senate is supposed to start its August recess next week. The question is whether senators will be packing their suitcases or unpacking another round of White House priorities. Plus, before governments commit billions of dollars to an infrastructure project, they have to decide how they'll measure success. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Trump administration has 20 additional ideas for improving federal acquisition. These range from dramatically increasing the simplified acquisition and micro-purchase thresholds to raising the dollar figures on task order protests to allocating more money for acquisition workforce training. The Office of Management and Budget submitted these legislative proposals to Congress earlier this month. For more on what OMB is asking for, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller joins me now. Jason, great to have you.
Thanks, Terry.
20 is a big number for legislative proposals. What are some of the ones that are causing the biggest buzz out there?
There's a lot of legislative proposals here, Terry, and 20 seems like a lot. Some of these are repeats from previous years, things that Congress just didn't get around to or didn't have a lot of interest in. And as you and I know, we've been following this a long time. Anytime you want to try to get anything through Congress, you got to tell it to them again, and tell it to them again until it finally kind of registers. But there's a couple here that I think really stand out. And one of them is to increase the simplified acquisition threshold. Currently, it stands at $350,000. They increased it on October 1st, 2025 for an inflation adjustment. But what GSA and OMB really are proposing here is to increase this incredibly high. First of all, they want to go to $500,000 just in that, kind of the regular simplified acquisition threshold. Then for commercial products and services, they want to, over the next 5 years, increase it to $10 million. So $2 million as of September 30th, 2027, $5 million on October 1st, 2027 through September 30th, 2030, and then $10 million after September 30th, 2030. Now, this would be an incredible increase, one that, we just don't see. And I spoke with a couple people, one of them, Alan Thomas, former Federal Acquisition Service Commissioner, and he goes, that is definitely catching a lot of people's attention. He talked about this idea of really pushing the acquisition workforce to use more fixed price and commercial services. And I think this is a way to kind of get that little push through. I also talked with Rich Butel. Rich spent many, many years on Capitol Hill looking at these legislative proposals, working for Oversight and Government Reform Committee in the House. He's now at the Baroni Center for Government Contracting. And Rich also said this is a big thing. This is something that actually the Baroni Center and he really promoted as part of a white paper. He thinks it's well past the time to push up these increases to simplified acquisition threshold, as well as, and I haven't gotten to this yet, the micro purchase threshold. He believes that between inflation and other things, the revolutionary far overhaul, it's just time to really take a look at this and increase it. The micro purchase threshold is another area where the administration really wants to increase it. There's two things here about the micro purchase threshold that's interesting. The first is under $15,000, they would kind of suspend, exempt from the Buy American Act, which has been a big area. But once they go above $15,000, again, slowly increasing it to $100,000 over the next several years, they would have to comply with the domestic sourcing laws. And in fact, part of the proposal would be for GSA to create, we'll call it a very special schedule for Buy American Act compliant goods and services, a way to promote this idea. So I think both of these, the micro purchase threshold, the simplified acquisition threshold, are really of interest to a wide part of the community because of how much they do want to increase it.
They probably reflect the buying experience of most people, in addition to the buying experience of the federal government. But speaking of buying experience, Jason, there's a particular request for more money for acquisition workforce training. Why is that so important?
Two things are standing out, I think, about this request. Number one, I think this is the recognition that the revolutionary far overhaul, the major rewrite, is going to take a lot of time and a lot of training. And listen, Terry, we know there's resources that are needed to do that training. There's tens of thousands of acquisition workers across the government. There's new ones being hired. To get them to understand all the pieces and parts that go into all the different parts of the FAR, they need to invest in more training. So currently what GSA does is through the Acquisition Workforce Training Fund, they have about 5% of the dollars coming in through the schedules, through the GWACs, the fee, 5% of those fees get pushed into this Acquisition Workforce Training Fund. What the proposal is doing is saying we want to increase it from 5% to 7.5%. So as someone told me, that's a 50% increase in terms of the amount of fees. And this would allow the Federal Acquisition Institute, the Defense Acquisition University, to really spend more time, more money, more focus on getting the workforce trained on this revolutionary FAR overhaul. I want to say for years, the lack of funding for acquisition workforce training has been a big, big issue. Especially, there was not a lot of parity between DoD and the civilian agencies through FAI. DoD funded it well. They put a lot of money into it. The civilians, it felt like more like begging, borrowing, stealing from wherever they could. So the fact that GSA got this money initially through the Acquisition Workforce Training Fund, through the schedule contracts, through the fee structure, was a big win for them. But still, I think they see it as, hey, we need more because of the revolutionary FAR overhaul.
When you think, Jason, about raising the ceilings on micro purchases and simplified acquisition threshold and increasing training, and you mix that with the other 17 proposals, do you see a theme that's kind of running through all of this?
There's two themes that really struck to me. First of all, Alan Thomas said he believes, and based on his experience of working in government and working in industry, that what GSA OFPP is trying to do is bring some parity to the Defense Department and the civilian acquisition world to say, hey, there's a lot of things here that, you know, a acquisition workforce person has to learn both sides, or they only learn one. Oh, I only know DoD, so I don't want to go to the civilian world. Or vice versa, I only know civilian, so I don't want to go to DoD. And what we've seen over the last several years is OFPP and the administration pushing, hey, we want parity so everyone gets trained the same way. You saw that with the changes to the contracting officer representatives, the core requirements, the FACC. I'm getting well into my acronyms here, Terry. So hopefully the audience will either forgive me or understand what we're talking about. But they're trying to get the training all together. Now, I think what they're doing with these legislative proposals is really saying the same thing. And I'll give you an example of one of them that I think stands out. The bid protest authority and the threshold for task order contracts. So you want to buy something off the schedule and the vendor protests it. Well, currently at DoD, it's $35 million over the life of the contract. So the contract has to be worth at least $7 million a year to be protestable. In the civilian world, Congress set it at $10 million. So again, $2 million a year over 5 years. And what they're saying is they want to bring everybody up to $35 million. And that's a pretty big change because a lot of civilian agencies do not have $35 million task orders. NASA, sure. DHS, probably. But, you know, think about places like Commerce or Interior or even, for instance, SBA or OPM. They're not going to have a lot of, you know, huge task orders in that way. And that probably is also concerning for industry to say, hey, we're going to lose some transparency, the ability to protest, because a $35 million task order at HUD, that's a lot of money. And if I get shut out of that, I want to be able to protest. So I think that's another one where two things here. It's bring some parity to DoD, but also that may upset some apple carts because, again, they're raising the threshold. The other through line here, I think, is GSA saw some challenges and problems over the years that they're trying to fix. One of them is the idea of having task orders where price is only at the contract level versus task order pricing at the top level. So I'll give you an example. Terry, I'm going to buy some widgets. The only price that matters is not the price per widget that I've got my schedule through, but if you're going to buy 10 widgets, you get one price. If you get 100 widgets, you get a lower price. That buy level is really where it's at. And what happened is there are some technical amendments that didn't quite get through to have kind of these unpriced or priced at the schedule level, at the task order level that they're trying to push through. So again, I go back to there's a few things that GSA and OMB is trying to do is fix that I think they've been trying over the years.
And Jason, what comes next for these proposals? Are they on Congress's metaphorical desk right now?
They are definitely on Congress's desk. The biggest, I think, frustration, and I heard this from Rich Butel, is they probably should have gone up to the Hill several weeks ago. The only way a lot of these proposals will get through is through the defense authorization bill. Not a lot of other legislation is going to get through. These are never going to be standalone pieces of legislation. They may get introduced, but usually things get added to the NDAA. So the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee in the Senate, the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and they begin here, and they would be able to add amendments to the NDAA. Unfortunately, we know the House NDAA already passed the House, so that really just leaves the Senate. We saw something similar this week with a letter about the Technology Modernization Fund and renewing that through an anomaly. There's a letter from several government associations. So really, I think the focus here is, can the Senate add some of these provisions, some of these amendments, and maybe the House will agree to them. I think that's what we'll be watching for.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks so much for this update.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the Senate is supposed to start its August recess next week. The question is whether senators will be packing suitcases or unpacking another round of White House priorities. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The House has already left town, but the Senate still has a crowded agenda that includes spending legislation, nominations, and other administration priorities. Whether lawmakers actually leave Washington as scheduled may depend on how much of that work they can complete first. Here with the latest is Bloomberg Government's Deputy News Director, Lauren Duggan. Lauren, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
The Senate was in town last week all by themselves. They did move some things forward. It was a big week for confirmation hearings. They got some key defense folks through. Talk about that first.
Sure. I mean, they started off their week with confirming Jay Clayton to be the full-time Director of National Intelligence. Bill Pulte has been serving as the interim there for a while, and there was interest among a lot of senators in getting a full-time person on there. That was off the to-do list. They also got halfway through with a package of 74 nominees that is pulling together things like TSA, FEMA, Deputy OMB Director, some judicial positions, and ambassadors. So that moved at least halfway over the line, and they'll try to get back to that. So there was good news, some committee action too, getting the potential head of the CDC through the Senate Help Committee. So we saw a lot of things move forward, but I think inherent in your question is that some things didn't move forward, which we can maybe touch on.
Let's do that, because some things didn't move forward, most specifically the AG.
That's right. Todd Blanche, who has been nominated, he's acting attorney general now, has been nominated to be full-time. His committee vote, though, had to be canceled after there was pushback from Republicans, in particular John Cornyn of Texas and Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who wanted some sort of assurance around the $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund that was created several months ago as part of a settlement between the government and Trump. So we will see if they can move that forward in the coming weeks. President Trump said that he might withdraw the nomination and just have him serve in an acting capacity till those two senators are gone. But those senators also said, at least one of them, that they're not the only people that have concerns about this. So that one seems on a yellow light, at least going into the weekend. We'll see if they can work something out, though.
Lauren, when you think about the Blanche hearings and you pair them with the Fauci testimony that certainly got a lot of headlines last week, I don't want to revisit the content of that so much, but the atmosphere around both of them and the Republican positions versus the Democratic positions. What does that tell you about the governing approach, kind of what's left on the runway between here and the midterms?
I mean, the next few months will be rocky, but they also won't be here very much. So they'll use these windows where they are here to draw contrast. And some people want to litigate aspects of the COVID response, including Fauci's role in it, because he was so prominent across both the last year of the first Trump administration and into the Biden years as well, things that he did there. So I think, they're trying to draw a contrast. They're trying to make that happen. But, Democrats will say if you give us the gavels next year by giving us the majority in the House and the Senate, they have different questions that they want to ask of different people. So we've seen tough questions put to witnesses already by Democrats and, as we noted, some Republicans, and that'll probably continue. And I think the confirmation path, if the Democrats make significant gains in the Senate or take it over, becomes much more difficult.
So do these hearings become less about the content of the hearings themselves and the creation of talking points for folks when they're home on the campaign trail?
I mean, I think that's part of it. A good clip on the media is helpful to you, and social media, perhaps even more so, where people are looking for that. One of the things I noted before the hearing is Rand Paul, the senator of the Government Affairs Committee that held that hearing, put out a lot of tweets about Anthony Fauci, and many of them used memes and probably AI generated things about Fauci, referencing his diary and other things. So, I think there was trying to build momentum on social media before the hearing, then get the clips from the hearing. That is an ecosystem that people exist in.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, that Senate is still going to be here for the rest of this week, at least, maybe longer. We're not sure if they're packing their suitcases yet or not. So let's turn our attention to what's on the agenda for the coming week. Let's start with the continuing resolution. That seemed to make some progress.
Yeah, they've been working hard to get a bipartisan version of this continuing resolution that they can get through the chamber and send over to the House. Now, the House passed one before it left, going through December 4th, and not very many of the so-called anomalies or funding adjustments that you normally see in a continuing resolution to allow the government to operate a little differently than it did the year before, even as you're pulling the funding levels forward. The White House sent up a list, and that was part of the discussions, and then maybe using this vehicle for other things as well. So, going into the weekend, they were optimistic about getting to a deal and getting a bipartisan basis and maybe moving that quickly through the Senate, sending it over to the House, which could deal with it perhaps when it comes back.
Senator Thune has also been pretty clear that that's his preferred funding method, not the Reconciliation 3.0, but that's still on the table for this week as well, right?
It's on the table. There's a lot of interest in doing that from a lot of corners of the Senate, but John Thune has said, show me the path to 50. If you can get me 50 votes to get that passed and to get over the vote-a-rama, the late night series of votes that would entail, maybe they'll move forward on that. Lots of White House pressure in particular to do that with key meetings last week. New budget chairman Ron Johnson, I think, would like to do that as well. And one of the reasons is because the Save America Act is tied up into that, the president's preferred voter administration legislation. While that bill couldn't contain all of it, they're trying to find the budgetary nexus for some of the things they want to do so that they could get that in a possible reconciliation bill. And this would just be the resolution, not the actual bill, but it's the first step that has to be done before you can get there.
That does remind me of a question I wanted to ask you about the continuing resolution, because that has in it a provision that would preempt the administration's grant approval rules, does it not? Senator Collins is pushing that forward.
She has been interested in that, and we'll see if that's language that survives. She had also said maybe a different bill would be a better vehicle for that, but you always have must-pass legislation as potential vehicles for that sort of thing. And, she might want to push for that in this and might get some backing. But that could also become a sticking point later on with the White House and others, so we'll have to see.
It does seem interesting that there's a bipartisan movement to oppose that approach, though.
It does. And, sometimes you get strange bedfellows on these issues, especially when it comes to money for back home and for your constituents. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to watch play out.
There are some other bits of legislation that may come up as the Senate does its work this week, especially one about Russia sanctions in memory of Senator Graham. What are you hearing there?
Yeah, bipartisan support for that. I think 80 plus votes in the two different procedural votes they had last week on that, trying to get consensus on moving that forward, probably a time agreement to speed that up. But it would be a tribute to Lindsey Graham, who was working on that literally, it sounds like, up until when he died. And if they can get that through, it'd go back to the House, who would have to accept it. Some Democrats in the House don't love the approach, but I think it was Richard Blumenthal, a senator from Connecticut, who said this can become a law, so let's get behind this and do something unified. So we'll be watching to see if they can get that over the line this week.
Cryptocurrency may also come up, and the revision to college sports.
Those have been two that they've talked about. They've not seemed quite ready. The crypto thing, there was still language being traded back and forth on the ethics part. Democrats working with the White House and Republicans trying to come up with something there. The college sports thing also seems like it might not have everything it needs to do to get over the line before they leave, especially if they try to stick to their schedule of leaving on Friday. But as you mentioned earlier, there are some senators who would love to stay and talk about Save America and other things well into the weekend or even beyond. So we'll have to see.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute, because there seems to be a lot of political pressure angling to keep the Senate in session. What's your sense on the Hill?
I think there's Republicans and Democrats alike who are ready to take a little break and get away from the action. One of the reasons behind the staying, as I mentioned, is the Save America Act, which is tied up in a lot of different things and hanging over everything. But that's another thing where there haven't been the votes, either the 60 you would need to do it under the normal processes or the 50 to change the filibuster as the president has called for. So people don't want to stay around for something that isn't going to succeed. You know, sometimes they stay an extra day or two to get something over the line and in the other chamber or even to law, but I'm not sure that that's going to be enough. But we'll see if there's a vote on that. There usually isn't a vote to leave, but some senators have said they may force that. We'll see if that happens.
Well, the whole point of August recess is to get them home, to be with their constituents, and to line up campaigning for the midterm. I know you have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the primary space and the midterms. Any news there to share?
Tuesday is a key primary in Michigan, particularly that Senate race that pits kind of the two different brands of Democrats against each other. We've talked about that a lot and seen that a lot in other states. So I think a lot of focus is going to be on that Senate Democratic primary. But there are a lot of states that are voting in August and then into September, the last big push here before November. We'll be watching that very closely.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, a strong market can make investors feel smarter than they really are. It can also make them forget how much risk they're carrying. But first, before governments commit billions of dollars to an infrastructure project, they have to decide how they'll measure success. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Public-private partnerships are often justified through something known as a value for money analysis. New federal guidance aims to make those evaluations more transparent by putting greater emphasis on data, assumptions, and documentation. Here to discuss those changes and what they could mean for future infrastructure decisions is Cher Habibi, Research and Policy Director at In the Public Interest. Cher, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
We're going to talk about some new guidance from the government on how to value and consider options in public-private financing. But before we start that, I'd love for you to kind of back up and tell us, maybe by example, maybe by story, what are the differences here between privatizing public assets and actually building a public-private partnership?
Yeah, so let's just kind of think about what are the activities when we're building a piece of public infrastructure, like a highway, a bridge, a water system. What are the activities that are involved? And there's kind of 5 major activities: the design of the piece of infrastructure, the actual building of it, the financing of it, the operations, and the maintenance. And under a more conventional project delivery approach, those are mostly done by the public sector. So you have an agency that figures out what they need and they design the project. They figure out how it's going to be funded and financed, and they're typically using public financing that's available to them. And then they are typically hiring a private construction firm or firms to help them build it. But then the long-term operations and maintenance of that asset is done by public sector staff. In a P3 model, a public-private partnership model, this kind of exists on a spectrum, but there is more private involvement. And in some cases, all five of those functions, all five of those activities are done by a private entity or a consortium of private entities. And so you have a private entity that will design the piece of infrastructure. They will figure out how to finance it, including private financing. Private financing is typically involved in P3s. And then they're going to have a private construction firm that's building it. But then also they are going to have a private team that is operating and maintaining that piece of infrastructure for the life of the contract. And I think one of the cautions that we have is that when there is greater private control over a public infrastructure project, there are decisions that might be made that are not the same as when there's public control. So this is public infrastructure. There's a public purpose, a public mission. We want this piece of infrastructure to serve the public. Those types of decisions may be more easily made when there's public control over the asset. One concern that we have is that the considerations like private investors, rate of return may be something that is more considered over kind of that public mission of the infrastructure. So there is this loss of control that happens.
So for folks who are perhaps in the decision-making seat about which way to go on a project around public infrastructure, the new guidance from the government talks about a value for money analysis, and I kind of think about it as life cycle cost analysis. How are folks supposed to use this guidance, and what does it tell them about the different approaches to the project?
Yeah, so that's exactly what a value for money analysis is. It compares the life cycle costs of different project delivery methods. And what this guidance does, that was issued several months ago from the Federal Highway Administration and its Build America Bureau, is it really provides some clarification of how and when to use that value for money analysis. So this is done at the very beginning to kind of figure out, hey, which route should we go if we're considering a P3 approach? We have what this guidance says. I mean, it says a lot of things, but but there's several provisions that I think are really helpful. The first one is that the guidance directs public agencies to establish delivery goals. So what are our goals in delivering this piece of infrastructure? So kind of looking a little outside that just financial lens. And they give some examples like maximizing the use of innovative approaches and technologies, preserving flexibility for future improvements, promoting economic well-being, creating high-quality jobs. So these are all good things that kind of go beyond just the, really dry dollars and cents of how much, the project costs. So I think that's really good. The other thing that this guidance does is that it places an emphasis on what types of data are the best types of data to use. And specifically, what this guidance says is that agencies should use actual verifiable data. And when that's not available, they need to provide a basis for any predictions or assumptions that are used. And so this is incredibly important. We have analyzed some value for money analyses that have been done by various jurisdictions. And one of the things that we have found is that sometimes the data or the assumptions that are used are just kind of taken as fact. And they're not really the kind of the methodology that's used to get to these assumptions, where this data came from or where these predictions came from, how the person who did this analysis or firm that did this analysis kind of came to those assumptions. They're not always explained. And as we know, in any model, it's a little bit of a black box. And so kind of the inputs that you put in highly, highly determine what the output is. And so, what we really have encouraged is you want to do a really robust analysis that has very sound methodology. And I think what the guidance does is it says that. It says, look, you got to make sure that your data that you're using or the assumptions and predictions that you're using, you can back them up. And I think that's really important in getting a valid response from this model. And then lastly, I'll note one other thing is the guidance does highlight the importance of transparency and the ability of the public to be able to access the analysis. And I think this is incredibly important because the devil is in the details, and having stakeholders and community members, allowing them to have the ability to actually look at this and ask the hard questions is only going to make for a stronger decision making process in the long run.
Cher Habibi is Research and Policy Director of In the Public Interest. So Cher, if a governor or a mayor or even the transportation secretary is evaluating a major project and they're using VFM, what's the single most important question they should ask before accepting that VFM tells them that it's a public-private partnership and that's a better option?
One thing that we really recommend and going to, I think there's probably, let me actually say two things to answer your question. Again, one is you want to make sure that you have a model that is robust and sound, and the methodology is sound, and that you're using sound inputs. That is probably, in terms of the actual analysis, one of the most important things that you can do. One important part of this analysis is that it quantifies risk, and it is based on this idea of risk transfer. And there's kind of this idea that if the private sector is doing more of these activities, then that transfers risk from the public sector onto the private sector, and we can actually quantify those risks. What is interesting is that it doesn't always actually work out that way. There's an assumption that if the private sector is doing it, then they're going to have an incentive not to have cost overruns or not to have delays. And those are priced into the model. Unfortunately, what we have seen in some examples of P3s, such as there was an airport in Denver that, tried to do some expansions and improvements via a P3 model. There were a lot of cost overruns and delays. The contract was eventually canceled. Even in the DC area, there's been a lot of reporting on the issues with the Purple Line and the kind of delays and cost overruns, an eventual contract, renegotiation on, that P3 project. So just, really understanding how you are assigning, really understanding that data and how you're assigning those risks. But then the other thing is really kind of moving outside of just this financial model. What are the things that your community really values? If it is you want a piece of infrastructure that is accessible and affordable to the public, how does that differ between the models? Who is getting these jobs? What are the environmental impacts? I just think there's a lot of, or what are the impacts on the regional economy? And so just really kind of even being able to move outside, go a little broader than what the VFM currently calls for, and really understanding what is the public mission of this piece of infrastructure? What does the community value? And understanding how these models either deliver or hinder those public goals.
And I think that's so important. Some of those public goods are very difficult to quantify. So
Yes.
When you're looking at a math model, and trying to make a decision here, how do you value or acknowledge the difficulty in quantifying those public goods, and how do they factor into the decision-making process?
I mean, some of the things that I mentioned may not be able to be quantified. It may be very difficult to quantify them. And so I think, but right now, some of those things are not even being discussed as part of the decision-making process. And so our recommendation is, do a really good sound, methodologically sound VFM, but also get community input, understand what the community needs. And there can be another piece of this that may not look like hard numbers, but that's being taken into consideration when you're deciding, whether to go with a model that has more public control or a more privatized model.
Cher Habibi is Research and Policy Director of In the Public Interest. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is such an important discussion.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to her report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a strong market can make investors feel smarter than they really are. It can also make them forget how much risk they're carrying. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The first half of the year delivered strong returns for many TSP investors, but rising balances can sometimes mask a more important question: how much risk sits underneath those gains? Here with a mid-year reality check is certified financial planner Arthur Stein. Art, it's nice to have you back.
Thank you, Terry. It's always good to be here.
We are about halfway through the calendar year, and it seems like a good time maybe to take stock of where the TSP is. And I would imagine a lot of people are feeling pretty happy given how the market has played out in the first 6 months of this year. Should people be sitting back on their TSP laurels, or should they be doing some reevaluation of their portfolios at this point?
Well, I think this is the most unexpected stock market rally since COVID. Where COVID, whole world economy shut down, and we had a 35% decline in the C fund, which is the S&P 500 stock index fund in the TSP. But then it turned out to be a great year. I mean, the C fund was up about 18%. Now, I don't think news is as bad right now, but we are in a situation. We have, multiple conflicts in the Middle East, higher oil prices, higher inflation, higher interest rates, higher U.S. debt levels. And also, I would point out that midterm elections, usually on average, the quarter before midterm election is frequently a negative quarter for stocks. And so there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic. Now, there is one really solid reason to be optimistic about stocks, or that might explain why it's been such a good year, and that's that corporate earnings are up about 25% over the last 12 months, which is a really solid increase. And stock prices, reflect corporate earnings. I mean, that's what you're paying for, to share in the corporate earnings. But still, the first quarter of the year was pretty bad. The second quarter was great. So far this year, the C fund's up 10%, S fund 18%, I fund 16%. Those are really, great rates of return for a 6-month period. One other thing to worry about is there's a lot of what can be called speculative fever, fear of missing out. FOMO is the acronym. And people see the market going up and they get excited and they buy in. There have been a couple of recent polls and studies. A Harris poll found that 80% of respondents admitted that they had been making high risk or speculative investments because they felt financially left behind. Another more solid statistic is that Americans now have 45% of their total financial assets in stocks. That's the highest it's ever been. The previous peak was 39% in 2000. And, we certainly see this in the TSP, where the percentage invested in the C fund has gone up and the percentage invested in the G fund has gone down, over longer periods of time. So it means that feds are, much more invested in stocks than they used to be.
Art, is that folks taking a conscious position there, or is it just a function of a long market run-up?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. And a big one is the L funds, because newer employees are automatically invested in, an L fund where that's going to mature and go into the I fund many decades in the future. Those L funds can have as much as 99% in the stock funds. And that has increased the percentage in the stock funds. Of course, another reason, Terry, as you just mentioned, stock returns have been great, so that increases the percentage. But I think in general, people are more secure, comfortable with stock investments. They've heard for a long time, that they outperform. And recent stock market declines have been very short term. The one in 2020 lasted months. The one in 2022 lasted months. But some previous market declines, like 2000, was the longest term one since the Second World War. It was 3 straight years of declines in the stock markets. I mean, that was really grinding. That was really hard on investors. So, if people wanted a recommendation, I would say, one, don't chase returns. Just because stocks have done well isn't a reason for you to put more or less in stocks. Choose an allocation between the stock funds and the bond funds that's right for you. But also, we need to be emotionally prepared for a big market decline. I mean, it's going to happen. It's a regular part of the market cycle. And employees need an emergency fund because there could be another government shutdown in September and because their jobs are no longer secure. Retirees need an emergency fund so they won't have to withdraw from the TSP and other investments when the stock and bond markets are down.
Arthur Stein is a partner with Allworth Financial. Art, at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about a number of global factors that add uncertainty into the market. And then you talked about a natural correction that's coming up. If the market dropped 15% tomorrow, who would be most surprised? Folks who invested in the C fund, the S fund, the I fund, or folks maybe who thought they were playing it safe in an L fund?
I think the most surprised are going to be a lot of the L fund investors, because many times they don't realize what a high percentage of their L fund investments are in stocks. A lot of the L funds are, as I said, 99% stocks. I would never recommend to a client that they have 99% of their investments in stocks. To me, it's like too much. Maybe for a younger employee, 80-20 or something like that. But the L fund's very heavily invested in stocks. I think a lot of the L fund investors don't realize it. And I think it's going to be a big shock when we get the market crash, which is not 15%, but it's 20% or more. I mean, that's really a major decline. Could be 30, 40, 50%.
Why do you think there's such a disconnect between what people think they own and what they actually own in the TSP?
Okay, well, I speak to a lot of Feds because a lot of my Feds are clients. A lot of the people I speak to are Feds. And I think most of them have been told that the L funds are safer. And so they invested in them, and they've been told they no longer have to worry about their allocation because the L funds are going to take care of it for them, which they will. But they don't realize how the L funds work, which is that in the beginning, like, if you were investing in the L 2070 or 2080 fund today, it would be about 99% stocks. And in about, 10 years, I think it is, then you start to see a decline. But even about 5 or 6 years before the fund matures, is what I call it, say it's 2075, you're in the 2080 fund, you would still be about, more than 50% stocks, more than 50% stocks. It's only in that last 5 years that it really becomes conservative. And then it becomes too conservative. All of a sudden, you're about 80% in bonds, which means the G fund and the F fund, and those are likely to lose purchasing power after you take into account taxes and inflation. So to me, the L funds take you where you don't want to go. They start you out overinvested in stocks, and you then end up underinvested in stocks. And most people don't realize it.
You mentioned the importance of planning for emergency funds. If you could offer one other piece of advice, maybe around risk and return, how would you want people to be evaluating their portfolios right now?
Well, I think they just need to understand if they're long-term investors, which means that, some of their investments are there to pay for stuff 10, 20, 30 years from now, that historically and past performance is no guarantee of future performance. Stocks have had, in well-managed, diversified portfolios, have had a high enough rate of return to increase purchasing power. Bonds did not. The G funds certainly did not. Bank accounts do not do that. So when people say, the G fund is safer, really it's only less volatile. It's safe in that one way. It is less volatile, but it's riskier in terms of losing purchasing power.
Arthur Stein is partner with Allworth Financial. Art, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Trump administration has been pushing federal agencies to aggressively adopt artificial intelligence capabilities. And now a new Commerce Department center is serving as a gateway for connecting the AI industry with government. To break it all down for us, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, thanks for being here.
All right, thanks for having me.
We know this administration has been super focused on striking these big contracts with the AI companies. How does the Commerce Department fit in?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I think important for industry to be watching here. The Commerce Department established what's called the National AI Center in San Francisco earlier this year. Now, this center was called for as part of the 2025 AI Action Plan that the Trump administration put out. And its sort of whole purpose, or at least its big purpose, is gathering proposals from industry to then export full stack packages to foreign countries, to foreign businesses. It's essentially all about selling American AI abroad. And that could be everything from, chips to AI services and everything in between. So it's really there to be an advocacy center within government to prioritize export licenses and to help these American companies access federal financing where they might be able to. But there's also another really interesting mission that this new center has, and that's to now actually work with American AI companies, those same companies that they're working with on exports, to then connect them to government agencies who might need their services. And that's something that Moksh Jawa, Chief Technology Officer at the Commerce Department, spoke a little bit about during a federal emerging technology showcase hosted at the General Services Administration's headquarters last week.
Now we're hyper-focused on also enabling American AI companies to work directly with government. And by setting up an outpost in San Francisco, we want that to be kind of a top-of-funnel or evaluative office that can be used to enable those relationships.
So that is really interesting. How does what Commerce is trying to set up there fit into what agencies like General Services Administration have been doing with AI?
Yeah, so Commerce and Jawa said that this center is going to work closely with GSA to help evaluate technology, and they're partnering with them to actually spin up some of the functionality out at the National AI Center. And if you think about it, this fits in really well with what the Trump administration has been doing through things like OneGov, which has centralized government contracts and spending in areas like AI and has struck deals directly with AI companies, the original equipment manufacturers, as opposed to going through resellers. And so clearly there has been a push to centralize AI procurement, technology procurement, and work directly with those companies. And now this Commerce Department National AI Center is going to have kind of that role in really facilitating those partnerships.
What lessons have they learned so far from getting that center up and running?
Well, one of the interesting things the center has done is released a request for proposals to be a part of the American AI exports program and to join a consortia that will then be able to contribute to American AI exports under the center. And so that call for proposals went out in the spring. Commerce is evaluating them now. It'll be interesting to see when they award some of those spots in the consortia, because, clearly per Jawa's comments, they'll have potentially a role to then sell or partner at least with government. More broadly, GSA has been obviously working to bring AI to different government agencies. GSA itself has been a big AI user. Deputy Administrator Mike Lynch said that the AI use rate at GSA is now above 70% of the workforce, compared to about 10 to 15% at the start of the Trump administration. And during this emerging technology showcase, one of the things that came out of it was that different agencies, GSA and others, highlighted how you need to not just kind of throw AI at the employees and give them access and kind of tell them, have fun. You need to work with them to really train and think through how they can think how they work using AI, because otherwise it's just not going to really go anywhere. Employees are really busy. They have their way of doing things, and they need to kind of be helped in terms of making the most effective use of AI.
So as Commerce builds this closer relationship with industry out there in California, how does that advance the government's sort of broader AI ambitions?
I think this is an interesting point that Jawa made. AI relies on accessing data and then being trained on that data and continuously improving on that data, these recent AI models. And that's something that agencies are just kind of getting in the front door with through things like GSA's USAI test platform. And it's going to be a couple years perhaps before agencies really get up and running with kind of the continuous improvement side of AI. Here's what Jawa said.
A big part of AI deployments is the continuously improving nature, and that requires kind of finding interesting ways to expose data from our internal systems that can be fed into their AI technologies in some cases to continuously improve. And I think the cutting edge enterprises of today in American industry are very much thinking about how can they continuously improve their AI deployments. And I think USG today is at a stage where it just wants to get those AI deployments as effectively as possible across missions. But in order to eventually turn those deployments into continuously improving ones, I think a lot of the foundation and stepping stones need to be set up today as opposed to in a few months from today.
Well, Justin, this definitely sounds like an initiative to watch. What else did you learn from GSA's Emerging Technology Showcase?
One other thing that caught my ear was what the Office of Government-Wide Policy at GSA is working on as far as fraud. Back in May, GSA officially joined the White House task force to eliminate fraud, and that made sense at a kind of high level given GSA's central role in government buying and spending and managing real estate and so on. But now we have some more details on what exactly GSA is working on. Matt Batzel, Associate Administrator for the Office of Government-Wide Policy, said that he's been particularly focused on developing tools to get after federal procurement fraud. And by that, he means reckless or intentional misrepresentation to gain an advantage in federal contracting. Here's what Batzel said about how they're doing that.
Right now, a lot of it's detection work. 3 years or so in the future, I think that a lot of it will be automated, and there'll be risk scoring for all of the procurement world to be able to know also in real time, almost like a credit score or Carfax, something is coming in, there's a risk coming in, be aware of this at the contracting level.
Carfax for government, then.
There you go.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks so much for this update.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.